more people coming in. So my name is Geneviève Zuzhinsky. I'm professor of sociology and director of the Center for Russian, East European, and Eurasian Studies. And I'm very glad to welcome you today and to introduce our guest speaker, who's just overcoming jet lag, arrived last night from Germany, Professor Ulf Grunbauer, who is professor of Southeast and East European History at the University of Regensburg, where he's also director of the Leibniz Institute for East and Southeast European Studies. After studies in Graz, Vienna, Moscow, and Sofia, so as a good European, he traveled all over. He received a PhD from the University of Graz in Austria, and his habilitation from the Free University in Berlin in 2006. He works mainly on the social history of the Balkans in the 19th and 20th century, and his most recent book, published in 2016, is here. It's entitled Mobilizing Southeastern Europe, Immigrants, America, and the State since the late 19th century. And today, Professor Grunbauer will speak about class culture and the Gastarbeiters, contested meanings of labor migration in socialist Yugoslavia. We're very happy to hear this, to hear about this movement of guest workers working in Germany, but actually looking at the discourse surrounding that practice in the former Yugoslavia instead of the discourse actually in the host country, so in the sending country. So please join me in welcoming Professor Grunbauer.
Thank you so much for this nice introduction, also for the invitation to give a talk in at your university. Already told Liz that I don't know whether the talk is going to be very exciting, but I show brief clips from two very exciting movies, so at least this should be interesting. So when I contemplated which topic to suggest for this talk, I of course felt very tempted to talk about the current migration, so-called migration crisis in Europe. As you all know, Europe has become totally obsessed, policymakers and societies, with migration over the last years. I resisted this temptation and decided to speak about the very obscure country that is not anymore. But if pushed, again, I'm sorry for that. Somehow, they are not very compatible, my computer and the projector. But if pushed, I think one could make an argument while looking at the perceptions and representations of labor migration from the socialist Yugoslavia is a relevant theme. First of all, it helps to look at the experience of migration, which is much more typical for many parts of the world, which is emigration. Yugoslavia, like so many other countries in the world, experienced migration mainly as out migration and not so much as immigration. Looking at the representations and perceptions of emigration, how a society gets excited about people leaving and what kind of social anxieties and fears are debated through migration, also helps to reflect about inequalities in the knowledge production about migration. It's mainly immigration that is studied because it's also mainly countries that perceive themselves as immigration countries that actually can afford systematic migration studies. So I do think that this theme is not totally esoteric, but might also be of relevance for today. Okay, in this year we commemorated in many countries the 50th anniversary of 1968, which was a momentous year for the US, but also for Yugoslavia. In 1968, Yugoslavia almost won the European football championship in Italy. They led in the first final 1-0 until a very late equalizer by the Italians. And then they lost the replay at that time. If you know something about football, penalty shootouts didn't exist yet. And of course they lost because of hostile foreign forces. The well-known left-winger Dragan Djajic said in an interview about the reasons why they lost the final, "We were in a subordinate position due to a higher power." The referee Dienst, who came from Switzerland, was the Azzurri's 12th man, and they won only thanks to him. Again, Yugoslavia was failed by malign foreign forces. However, football probably was not on the mind of all Yugoslavs, because at the very same time, basically almost on the same day, when the Yugoslavs lost the final in Rome, students' protests broke out in Belgrade and then spread around other major cities, university cities in Yugoslavia. And these protests, they catch the government by surprise. The 1968 student demonstrations in Belgrade, in Zagreb, in Sarajevo, they are part of Yugoslavia's contribution to the global 1968. They inscribe Belgrade in a chain of events linking places like Berlin, Paris, Prague, and also college towns in the US. The irony is that the students in Yugoslavia, their protests were on the one hand a manifestation of Yugoslavia's openness and integration into the capitalist, the non-socialist world. On the other hand, the students protested against capitalism and against the West. They accused the ruling communists of betraying socialism, of building a semi-capitalist society. And one of the issues which provoked protest also by students was labor migration. Labor migration as well was a manifestation of Yugoslavia's openness to the West, but it also was a troubling aspect in the sense of increasing and generating new inequality. A police report about the slogans students shouted at demonstrations said, I quote, "The participants of the demonstration shouted the following slogans: Long live Tito, Tito party, down with the socialist bourgeoisie, down with the bureaucracy. We want employment in our country. We want a fair distribution of personal incomes. We do not want to go for work to Sweden." End of quote. And the issue of labor migration came up repeatedly in the proclamations of students. One of the first resolutions by Student Council at the University of Belgrade in June 1968 read, "It hurts us that thousands of our people must go abroad to serve and work for global capital." Students demanded that the state should undertake measures to guarantee employment for qualified workers in the country. And this was a very timely demand. 1968 saw a jump more than 100% in the number of people leaving Yugoslavia for employment abroad. By 1968, labor migration, out-migration, the so-called Gastarbeiter migration had become a topical issue in the public debate in socialist Yugoslavia. Newspapers, experts, policymakers, intellectuals constantly debated this problem. So my argument today is that the Gastarbeiter theme was inherently contentious in socialist Yugoslavia. Labor migration provoked different and often very ambiguous perceptions and equally ambivalent policy responses. One clear strand is the tendency of many observers, including the students, to articulate social critique by speaking about migration. I will argue that labor migration proved corrosive, not only because of its unintended social and economic consequences, but also because of its public perception and representation. It increased the contradictions in socialist Yugoslavia, both in a material and in a representational sense. Not least did the government, a communist government, fail to produce an ideologically coherent justification why so many workers would leave the socialist paradise in order to work in capitalist countries. Yugoslavia felt acutely that one of the premises of its sovereignty was under threat. Citizens left the purview of the state. Historian Charles Meyer once identified the congruence between the so-called identity space and the decision-making space as one of the fundaments of the modern territorialized state, which wields sovereignty about a certain territory with clear borders and the people on this territory, and expecting the exclusive loyalty of these people. People who move either into or from the territory of a state disrupt this order. And this, of course, causes headaches among modern bureaucrats. My general point is the following. The openness which made Yugoslavia such an outstanding socialist country also made it very vulnerable. The country integrated into the global division of labor, which was dominated by capitalism, yet it never managed to adapt its ideological and political system accordingly. International exposure and transnational practices increased the contradictions inherent to self-managed socialism until a point they could not be managed anymore. Nowadays, labor migration is commemorated more from a nostalgic point of view. At that time, very few people actually would have thought that this might become part of a nostalgia. So let me talk about the pains of the Gastarbeiter, the labor migrant. When reflecting about the connection between labor migration from Yugoslavia and social critique, 1968 is a good starting point, because in that year a very interesting, and I will show a brief clip, documentary film by one of Yugoslavia's best directors, Christo Papic, came out. This film was called Hallo München, Hello Munich. Papic was one of those Yugoslav directors that broke with the aesthetic canon of heroic partisan movies and rather used film as an instrument of social critique. Twice he did short documentaries about Gastarbeiters, Hallo München in 1968, and then Special Trains, Specialne Vlakove in 1972. And these two films are considered some of his most valuable documentary work. Hallo München pictures important aspects of the Gastarbeiter experience. You know, Gastarbeiter was the vernacular, although German, word used for labor migrants in Yugoslavia and still in use today. This movie reflected about alienation and strangeness, about the conflict between modernity and tradition, between city and village, between memory and the present, and between ideology and social reality. So this short movie, it's a 14 minutes movie, and encapsulated many of the big tensions characterizing socialist Yugoslavia. And so now comes one of the exciting moments, just to give you an idea about this film, few moments from its beginning.
Jure! 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 Halo! Ne čujem. Mihe!
Is there anyone
Čuješ?
celebration among you?
Jure!
Okay.
Maori se đava zapunta. Halo!
Broj u Frankfurtu se ne javlja.
Jure! Halo! Kako sam ti reka? Limuzinu nemoj dogonit, podaje đavlu, od nje kruva nema. Kamion dotra, ja čujem Marko dobro prolazi. Pravio je kuću, a čujem da pravi i u Splitu.
Kel u kabini 2.
Znaš njega, on
So
neće
people
kazat
trying to get the
svoje
phone
stvari.
connection to Germany in the
Kako sam
village
ti
in the
rekao?
Dalmatian hinterland.
Ne čujem. Od nje đava vezuj telefon. 100 puta i nikad uvatit veze. Alo?
And this is, of course, it's a region where people have been moving out already in the 19th century. As you can see, there's not very much that you can grow there. And before tourism came in, there was not much in terms of formal employment. If something goes wrong, then of course.
Just wait, it's just loading, right?
I don't know. Okay. Anyway, you find this movie on if you're interested in it on on the internet. I don't know whether I can risk also showing something from the second movie that Christo Papic made on the Gastarbeiters, which is called the Special Trains. Special trains were those trains that were organized to transport migrant workers from Zagreb, from Belgrade, mainly to Germany. That was probably his politically most dangerous work, because it clearly juxtaposed the people, which are presented as poor and powerless, against the government. The film is a reckoning with the inequality that haunted socialist Yugoslavia. It evokes empathy for workers who are unfairly treated in Yugoslavia and who, out of economic reasons, are forced to make an arduous journey into a foreign, unknown country. And at the same time, the film has only, or the director has only scorn for the government. There's a scene showing an employment office representative who is accompanying the migrant workers on the train to Germany, and he is presented as a heartless technocrat who boasts about the professional organization of the transportation of Yugoslav workers as they were any other goods to Germany. He has all the attributes, the guy, the right top corner, all the attributes of the so-called new class. Smoking a pipe, wearing an elegant suit and dark sunglasses. Rarely were class differences and the contrast between empty phraseology and real-life hardships so visible on the screen in socialist Yugoslavia. And the last scenes of the movie, when you see the workers, or the migrants, disembarking in the central train station in Munich, they also suggest that at the end there's a certain futility to emigration. People leave in the search for a better life abroad, but this life abroad wouldn't be so good at all. So you see people being brought into the basement of Munich train station in rooms that had served as bomb shelters during World War II, and then there's a scene when you hear through the loudspeakers a voice in Serbo-Croatian telling them, from now on you won't be referred to by your name but by the number of your work contract. And you can guess which sort of associations this scene evoke. Let me give you a brief, I don't risk to show you the clip, maybe it, I should risk it. Ah. So also descriptions in Greek. And we don't really know, but I mean it's probably a fair guess that labor migration to Germany was particularly, I never found any explicit reference, but going to a country which only generation before had devastated Yugoslavia, and the successful partisan struggle against German forces being basically the founding myth or the founding narrative of socialist Yugoslavia, might have added uneasiness in terms of how migration was perceived. Yeah, this is what the voice saying, from now on we will call you by the number of your work contract, and from Munich on they are divided to different places in Germany. Just to give you a little bit of background, I guess that most of you are familiar with the fact that Yugoslavia, socialist Yugoslavia, allowed labor migration into the West as the only socialist country to do so. A decision that was taken in 1963, 1964, after very contentious debates in the League of Communists. And the reasons why Yugoslavia decided to open its borders to work migration, before that labor migration had been outlawed, like in many other of the socialist countries. So the main reasons were economic, and the government had basically three main hopes. First of all, labor migration was thought to alleviate pressures on the domestic labor market. At that time, Yugoslavia introduced market-oriented economic reforms, which led to a rise in unemployment, a rise that was thought to be temporary, but actually became a permanent feature of socialist Yugoslavia, the only socialist country with officially recognized unemployment and on pretty high levels. At the same time, this was also the time when the baby boomer generation entered the labor market, so there was a real pressure on the labor market, and they thought that this might okay. I don't know what happened here. The second hope of the government was, and this was based on knowledge by experts on the consequences of overseas emigration, for example, from this from this area, that labor migration would result in an inflow of money, remittances, as we called it. And third, the government, because the labor migrants were supposed to return after a couple of years of work in Germany, this is why they were in the vernacular called Gastarbeiters, that they would return with new skills and so increased human capital. The Yugoslav government always felt a certain uneasiness when it came to labor migration for a couple of reasons, and this is also evident in the very name. So in Yugoslavia, in official parlance, the labor migrants were not even called migrants. They were called workers temporarily employed abroad. Radnici na privremenom radu u inostranstvu. And colloquially, the German word for them, Gastarbeiter, was used. There was a neat distinction in the way how migration was represented in Yugoslavia between emigration. These were those people who went to the US in the 19th century, and the Gastarbeiters. Migration from Yugoslavia, labor migration was based on bilateral recruitment treaties that Yugoslavia concluded with a couple of European countries, the first one with France in 1965, and the most consequential one with the Federal Republic of Germany in 1968. And these agreements, they were thought to be a kind of a safeguard, so that the government would maintain control over the whole process of migration, that also Yugoslav workers would be guaranteed certain employment and social rights in the countries where they were going to be employed, and also that they would come back. This was a major concern for the government. And this treaties also indicate one of the basic facts of the modern state, that the modern bureaucrats, they usually are not very happy about international migration. Modern states prefer sedentary populations that can be more easily be taxed, controlled, drafted in the army, school. For example, the fact that so many recruits would go to Germany became a major headache for the Yugoslav army. In the following section, I want just to run you through the main themes in the press coverage of labor migration. By 1971, more than 1 million Yugoslav workers worked abroad. This was 5% of the total population, but 20% of total employment in Yugoslavia. So this was really very, very significant, which is also the reason why newspapers constantly wrote about the Gastarbeiters and the experiences they made. I did in my research, which also entered in this book, which I'm happy to leave here, I collected some 1,500 articles, newspaper articles from the major Yugoslav newspapers from the 1960s and 1970s, reporting about a variety of themes connected with the Gastarbeiter migration. So if there's anyone wanting to write a thesis on the representation of the Gastarbeiter in the Yugoslav media, you're welcome to come to Regensburg. The articles are already there, a nice database, so you can immediately start writing the thesis. Basically, the research has been done, but not yet published. And there are a couple of major themes which are also interesting because they are connected also to policy responses. Yugoslav newspapers, obviously they were not free, but they were much freer, especially when it came to not super sensitive political topics than newspapers in any other socialist countries. Also because Yugoslav newspapers, they competed for readers. So they had to be informative, they had to be entertaining. And labor migration was such an important theme that, that newspapers very often wrote about it. One motive that comes out very, very often is that of the hard-working Yugoslav worker who toils abroad, who contributes to the what we call Wirtschaftswunder, the economic miracle of Germany and other West European countries, which was the case. This was a very welcome, cheap source of labor. Yugoslav newspapers usually stressed that Yugoslav workers were much better qualified than Gastarbeiters from other South European countries like Greece, Italy, which actually was also true. And this also reflected an important debate in socialist Yugoslavia, where economists eventually concluded that Western countries benefited much more from Yugoslav Gastarbeiters than the Yugoslav economy, which of course at the end raised the question about fairness of international relations, a recurrent issue in the region today when countries like Romania basically training the medical staff for many Western European countries who don't pay for that but happily recruit whole generations of graduates of medical schools from the region. Yugoslav newspapers also did not fail to mention the deplorable living conditions of Yugoslav Gastarbeiters, who often had to endure terrible work and work conditions, lived in cramped barracks, often became also victimized by anti-immigrant attacks in Germany or Austria. So you do learn a lot about the mundane hardships of migration. Each year for Christmas, when most of the Gastarbeiters came back for the holidays, you would read about epic queues at the Yugoslav border, migrant workers being jammed into trains. So this reporting did make clear that life as a migrant was not very easy. So the better life was not so great at all, which again reflected badly on the domestic government. Another important issue was the question of return. By the mid-1970s, it appeared that very many of the so-called Gastarbeiters eventually decided not to return, which became a major problem for the Yugoslav government. And one of the reasons why so many people did not return was the lack of domestic employment. So Yugoslav newspapers reported about problems of finding jobs for returnees, which again reflected badly on the current, on the situation in Yugoslavia. One of the, when you're studying the issue of representation of migrants, one of the interesting issues is in how far the authors of these images attribute agency to migrants. And here again, socialist Yugoslavia and the representation, perception of migration shows a certain ambiguity. On the one hand, newspapers very often presented Yugoslav Gastarbeiters as victims of the prevailing conditions of economic hardship, or of some concrete hostile forces, especially the so-called hostile emigration. Those emigres, nationalists, fascists, who run anti-Yugoslav campaigns, who even committed terrorist acts against Yugoslav diplomats and also representatives of Yugoslav business abroad. And the Yugoslav government was very worried that Gastarbeiters would fall under the influence of this so-called hostile emigration. And so you can read in Yugoslav newspapers about who terrorizes our workers abroad, for example, was a headline which indicates this important tension in the way how Yugoslavia approached emigration, sending Gastarbeiters on the one hand, but also fighting against hostile and anti-diaspora, if you want. And this was a very bloody affair, by the way, because the Yugoslav secret services killed dozens of radical anti-Yugoslav emigres. And denying agency to migrants is also a recurrent trope in representations of migration. For example, in the research that they did on overseas migration from Southeastern Europe in the 19th century, you would very often find in public debates this notion that, well, these illiterate, naive peasants, they actually were tricked by what we nowadays would call human traffickers into going to America, presenting it as a big mistake, although actually it presented a form of agency of people who lived under very difficult conditions and considered emigration one of the few opportunities to improve their life. On the other hand, sometimes newspapers and also experts attributed or praised the agency of Yugoslav migrants. Those, for example, who organized clubs or all sorts of cultural activities in order to maintain a Yugoslav identity. This was, of course, hate. And there was one particular phenomenon which was very often extolled also in the newspapers, but also by policymakers. These were so-called currency or Gastarbeiter factories. These were factories, usually small factories, that were created or expanded by money donated or invested by labor migrants. And basically the idea was that the Gastarbeiters, they saved money, and these were hardworking people who earned much more in Germany than they would in Yugoslavia, that they save money and then put together their savings into creating a factory in their hometown. Basically buying a job for themselves or for their family members. So there was also a certain irony in this program, because self-managed socialism was not meant to ask people for paying for their own job. And there were probably some 25 enterprises created on the initiative of Gastarbeiters, who associated their savings and invested into new factories. The economic viability was also not questioned much. Very many of these factories, they were created at the places where these people came from, and meaning at places which probably were not the best place to actually develop a factory, somewhere in the rural hinterland without much of an infrastructure. So to conclude on this, the Yugoslav newspapers sketched a very complex image of the Gastarbeiters, while also capturing many aspects of their life. So there are also really there's a wealth of useful information for analyzing the migrant experience. The growing opposition in the press towards out-migration in the 1970s reflected an equally growing suspicion and dissatisfaction among the government. There was widespread uneasiness, even some sort of suspicion towards the Gastarbeiters. The migrants were officially said to remain part of the Yugoslav working class, but at the same time, you can see in the public perception that migrants, Gastarbeiters, were sort of described as strangers in their own country, who did not fully fit anymore. They lived in between, or as one newspaper, Mladina, wrote, with the body there, with their minds here. So in a way, the transnationalism or trans-migrants avant le lettre. Let me conclude. Again, by returning to film, but I will not show that. Hristo Papić was not the only Yugoslav filmmaker concerning himself with migration. There were some between the mid-1960s and the late 1970s. There were at least 30 films, mainly documentaries, being produced in Yugoslavia and dealing with different aspects of the Gastarbeiter experience. And most of them emphasized the negative effects, the problems of Gastarbeiters, the problems of their left-behind families. And one of the most damning accounts came from the most notoriously dissident Yugoslav filmmaker, Želimir Žilnik, who is well known to anyone with an interest in Yugoslavia and beyond, who did some really excellent and very critical movies, which is why very few of his films actually could be shown in Yugoslavia. In 1968, he did, again 1968, obviously really a momentous year for Yugoslavia, he did a film called Nezaposleni ljudi, the unemployed people. In this film, he gives workers who were out of work at that time room to talk about their predicament. And the film shows that going to Germany is one of the very few options left to people who had been made redundant, which obviously was a scathing assessment of the achievements of socialism. Unsurprisingly, the official daily Politica criticized the movie for, I quote, superficial and cheap sociologiziranje, sociologizing, and effect seeking. And after one or two shows, it was banned. Žilnik's critique perfectly illustrates why labor migration was such a dangerous theme for the communist system in Yugoslavia, which after all, despite all its idiosyncrasies, was a one-party state. A one party which existed in 7 or 8 manifestations, but still. And why the representations of migrant workers mattered. The Gastarbeiters were a living embodiment of many of the failures of the Yugoslav economy, and also of the drawbacks of international integration, into the international, that is, capitalist division of labor. The Gastarbeiters put a question mark behind two of the main ideological pillars of the Yugoslav ruling regime, which were national independence and care for workers. By regularly reporting about the problems, of the many problems that Gastarbeiters faced, the press inadvertently reminded the public of unresolved fundamental problems, especially growing inequality. And these images were a constant reminder of the fact that, such as in the past, such as already in the 19th century or the interwar period, many people from this country, like from other parts of Southeastern Europe, went abroad in search of a better life, despite the promises of the government. Governments, ideologies came and left, but emigration remained one of the few options available to many people in the region. But I think there's also something that we can learn from the Yugoslav debate about migration. As I said, the country has gone, and it's difficult to connect past and present in this case. But I think what we do learn from the Yugoslav debate about, in this case, out-migration, is that migration should be debated in a social policy and inequality framework, and not in an identity and nation-building framework. Because that's the main problem if migration is becoming overcharged with issues of identity, then it becomes politically unresolvable, because as you know, about identity you cannot negotiate. Thanks for your attention.
We have time for questions. Do you want to take them yourself?
Yeah, I think.
One of the questions kind of about this work is I'm curious about, like, we talk about a country that is pretty massive and certain regions and provinces were richer or more well off than others. And so I'm curious if any of your work, if there was patterns of migration from, for example, Macedonia, which was always poorer compared to the other republics, versus Slovenia, which was pretty Europeanized at that point.
Yeah, very, very good. Thanks for this question. I failed to mention it actually. And first of all, I recommend reading this book because this gives an answer to, and it will be in the library here. Gives also part of the answer. First of all, what I failed to mention is one of the reasons why migration also became so problematic for a bit of ideological coherence in also political coherence in Yugoslavia, which was as we all know, a very incoherent and by sort of its own wish, very incoherent, very decentralized country, is that it not only reflected but also strengthened regional disparity. If you look at the map of Yugoslavia and how intense migration was, and there's wonderful statistics on the municipal level, exact numbers, so we can, and actually we did map migration intensity for all these many hundred municipalities that exist. Then you see a couple of regions with very high immigration and some regions with next to nothing. To explain this is not so easy because poverty or underdevelopment, as they used to call it, or less development or passive regions, also one of these Yugoslav concepts to describe less prosperous regions. It's not a very good predictor for immigration. So network effects are much more important. For example, Slovenia overall had a much higher rate of immigration than Kosovo, although it was of course much more developed. Although if we would consider also domestic migration, the picture already changes. That's one of the problems that actually research on migration is concentrating almost exclusively on international migration and not really dealing with the connections between domestic migration and international migration, which for Yugoslavia was hugely important. There was a lot of domestic migration, people from Kosovo, for example, going to Slovenia, where they, by the way, in Kavic, would experience very similar anti-immigrant resentment, or maybe even more than if they went to Switzerland or Germany. So it's not poverty per se, but it's, for example, the existence of migration networks. And Macedonia is a very good example. Macedonia was not so super affected by Gastarbeiter migration in the 1960s and 1970s, but for one or two regions. And one was the region around Bitola Monastery. This was exactly the place where a lot of people went to America before World War I. And you see these links, also Dalmatia, you see these links that even in the 1960s, a surprisingly high number of people from Bitola and its surroundings, from South Dalmatian islands, go to Australia or to the United States, which are not the typical destination countries for Gastarbeiters. But these are people employing migration networks that have been there for 2 generations. And that's really interesting because they didn't have their own migration experience, maybe even their parents didn't have, but their grandparents did have. And obviously these transnational networks were kept alive despite this huge political disruption, despite the war, despite the establishment of a communist regime which initially implemented very restrictive immigration policies. But at the end, migration contributed to regional disparity, and this was one of the most fundamental problems in socialist Yugoslavia and also for policy making, because the social and economic development of the constituent parts of Yugoslavia was so different, and therefore also the collective interests were very different. And even when it came, and at the end, everything comes down to money. And for example, the question how the migrant remittances should be distributed among the republics was also hugely controversial, because there was a calculus which led to actually discriminating republics like Slovenia and Croatia, who sent more migrants, and preferring those poorer parts of Yugoslavia from where less migrants came. So this was another contentious issue, how to distribute money. And so I would not say that labor migration was the thickest nail in the coffin of Yugoslav socialism, but it was one of those long-term developments which proved to be very corrosive, policy-wise, but also ideology-wise. Please.
So I had a question about the category or the guest workers, because the term comes from a specific type of work to rebuild Germany after the Second World War. So does that, I mean, I would imagine that over, half a century, it changes, but the category or the name remains, even though they might not have been going to Germany. I'm thinking about this because in Poland you have economic migrants, they go pick strawberries and they go to Scandinavia, a lot of Germany, but they don't use that term. So I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about that fact and whether or not economic migration changed and how over time.
I think the interesting thing about the concept of Gastarbeiter is that it encapsulates or embodies the myth of return on both sides. The myth of return on the side of the recruiting countries like Germany, where it was an official concept in Germany, and then became a vernacular one also in Yugoslavia. And they learned from this. Even in Russia, they speak of Gastarbeiters, so interesting circulation of a concept. So they were supposed to return, and until not so long ago, the immigration discourse in Germany, as you probably know, is also pretty paradoxical. You could call it schizophrenic. Until actually 15 years ago, until the government of the Social Democrats and the Greens, this coalition government, when Germany for the first time officially declared itself to be an immigration country, a country which at that time were 25% of the population were immigrants, also counting, of course, the many Germans that came as immigrants after World War II. But until that, immigration of non-Germans were always framed as Gastarbeiter migration, meaning that these people should return. And this was not just an empty talk, it was hugely consequential for the kinds of policies German governments did or did not pursue vis-a-vis immigrants, because integration, so-called integration, also a very problematic concept, I know, but so-called integration was not an official political goal of German governments until the early 2000s. On the contrary, the goal was to maintain, as it was called, the capacity to return. This, for example, led to a system it became sort of less coherent in the 1990s. But until the 1980s, where many children of Gastarbeiters were put either in special schools or in special classes, where they were taught in their own language, often also with the curriculum coming from their own country, so that their potential to return and to reintegrate in a society where they were not raised was maintained. So if Germany nowadays complains about the lack of integration, especially of its Turkish immigrants, which was and still is the most sizable group of foreign nationals in Germany, then it's not so much, it's probably also related sort of the value systems and cultural preferences of these people, but it's mainly caused by a conscious lack of integration policy. And on the other hand, as for the sending country, this myth of return, it never died. It's still there, but it was always postponed. So first, and we do know from surveys taken, Yugoslavia had really very good migration studies, very good sociology of migration, and they did a lot of large-scale surveys when these people come back, for example, during the holidays. So we do have really very good sociological information, and we do know that actually most of the Gastarbeiters, when they left, intended to return after a couple of years. But, well, plans change. The economic situation in Yugoslavia did not become much better. On the contrary, it became actually ever more difficult, especially with regard to unemployment. Where many returnees also really made very awful experiences, being basically discriminated when it came to access to jobs, to housing when they came back, because for local communities they were basically unwelcome competitors for scarce resources. So many returnees then re-emigrated. But still, talking about return, maybe then after retirement, which actually is what many people did, returning in a way, returning which is a half return during the summer, but only after retirement. But I think what makes it interesting, this concept of Gastarbeiters, is that it framed the way how people thought about migration and how also certain actions were taken or not taken. And even though it did not really very well describe the social processes, because many people did return, but most people did not return, it helps to understand why certain policies were taken and certain other policies were not taken, both by the sending country and by the destination country. Yugoslavia, and close with this, was one of the, because this is nowadays also one of these big themes in the international migration debate, how to support voluntary repatriation, how to make then return sort of useful for economic development. And Yugoslavia was one of the countries where the where UNDP and the OECD, this club of rich countries, experimented in the 1970s and 80s how to support voluntary return by Yugoslav migrants and to give them either money or technical skills so they would contribute to economic development of the home country. So there's a nice genealogy of the epistemology of how we think about the connection between migration and development, which actually starts in Yugoslavia in the 1970s and 80s, because was the only sending country in this Gastarbeiter system that really tried to facilitate return. India, Portugal, Greece, they were talking about return, but I mean, Salazar regime, Franco regime, they were actually happy that these people who were suspected to be socialists left and did not return.
Thank you.
So there's a question.
Yes, I guess you're, back there, sorry.
No,
Okay,
and the next one is back. Yeah.
Your talk emphasizes the negative aspects of this labor migration. I don't disagree with the things you pointed out, but I guess having lived in Yugoslavia in the late 70s and periodically in the 80s, I guess an image that I have of the impact of this labor migrations, a couple things. Houses under construction, where one floor would be built with money from remittances 1 year, and then a couple years later you build the next floor. Other images are small restaurants and bars with less than 5 employees, where the owner said, I had worked in Germany and this is what I was able to create, this source of income, and not a factory, which I would agree if it's placed in a rural area, it's not going to be very successful, but bars and restaurants do very well, or auto repair shops. Could you say a little bit more about that aspect, that there are indeed trade-offs, but sometimes those remittances were, at least for individuals, survival?
Definitely. I mean, that's exactly the point. It depends very much on the observer position and also whose interests we take as the frame of reference. Is it sort of the economic development as defined by economic planners in the national government, or is it the welfare of a family? And obviously for many families, migration the possibility to send the family members abroad was critical, not for survival in this case, but for a certain modernization of the living standard, of building new houses. If you travel through these emigration regions, you see this stark contrast between these old, very poor, small houses and then houses. I mean, they usually look very ugly, and you can tell where these people worked, but they are nice, decent, solid houses, very often unused. Sort of, the plastic never really put away from the furniture because people did not return, or when they built houses at a time where families were still very, very big, and married sons tended to stay with their parents, which then they didn't. So from this point of view, and Yugoslav economists, they struggled a lot with these questions, and they produced some really good research saying, and this is basically probably what most economists would also agree, there's a big debate in economics whether immigration is useful for the sending country or not from the aggregate point of view. And Yugoslav economists said, one of them coined it very nicely. He said that, well, labor migration led to modernization but not to development. Meaning that without labor migration, and in the first movie you can see that Hallo München, where these migrants come back with their new Opel, with their new Mercedes. Of course, people without this income would not possibly have afforded this kind of consumer goods. So it did lead to a modernization of material culture. Although, you know, if you compare the development of living standards between Yugoslavia and, say, Bulgaria when it comes to this kind of things, the difference are not so significant. So I don't know how much Yugoslavia did better because of labor migration. It was more a compensation for a lack of state investment. So at the end, I mean, it's a little. One would have to argue counterfactually, because we don't know what would have happened if there was no labor migration. Obviously, it increased, which is what migration opportunities always do. They increase the options that people without much power, without much capital have, which is per se good. But it does not necessarily help a country which is somewhere in the economic semi-periphery to leave this situation. And I think globally there are very few examples, actually probably not one example, where a country which grew dependent on emigration actually managed to leave this situation by making emigration useful for economic development. So these few successful catching up countries, they all did it actually by protectionism and by limiting immigration. So in the end, I don't know. But for the individuals, yeah, for families, definitely better to have this option than not to have it. But it led to already back then in the 1970s, there's good sociological research from those, especially villages, and most Yugoslav Gastarbeiters came from the countryside, showing that, for example, those families which grew dependent on remittances showed a lesser tendency to actually invest in the development of human capital, of skills, because it did not pay off, and also tended to become, to put it colloquially, a little bit more lazy. And there's nice ethnographic research showing, for example, how local hierarchies changed. Once the village teacher was the sort of most sought after partner for a marriage, but then these penniless educated teachers could not compete to more or less less educated young guys who had disposed of German marks. Thank you.
So you mentioned a little bit earlier that networks do a good job of, or a better job of at least predicting where you would have labor migration, and also the sort of agency involved in individuals deciding to migrate. But I'm still not, I'm still a bit unclear on sort of the sort of everyday bureaucratic practices that migrants had to go through. So in the sense of how did migrants actually know that there were positions in Germany? How were they recruited? How did they sort of, what kind of bureaucratic agencies did they have to go through? Yeah, I'm just a bit more curious about this.
Thanks, very good question. And the answer is, I find it a little bit relieving, because it shows how little states, even authoritarian states, can actually do in order to regimentate migration. So the basic idea was that all Yugoslav Gastarbeiters should go through the official system of the labor employment, of the employment office, who negotiated with the employers in Germany or wherever they were located, and who was supposed to select the migrants. They would run through a medical check and then really be allocated according to the demand of German employers. At the end, less than half of all labor migrants went through this official way. Very often they were either directly recruited by employers, by firms who were competing for skilled workers, and most Yugoslav labor migrants had some training, so they were semi-skilled at least, and therefore a rather popular workforce in German industry. Especially automotive industry, which became almost and still is dependent on migrant labor, but also the service sector, hotels. I mean, in Austria, you would not find an Austrian working in a hotel or as a waiter, basically. And they directly hired, although this was technically actually not allowed, but the Yugoslav state could not do much about it. And then many people, especially once official recruitment stopped, after the oil price shock in 1973, basically all European countries officially stopped these recruitment programs because they were all faced with rising unemployment in their own countries. But still many Yugoslavs managed, not only Yugoslavs, also Turks, managed to go either under the umbrella of family reunification or just by, rules were really much more lax than they are today, just by going to it. Much more easier to enter illegally, but then receive some sort of legal status and getting also the right to work. So at the end, more than half of the Yugoslav Gastarbeiters went on their own initiative or were directly recruited by German employers. And you also find a lot of collusion on the local level, municipalities also subverting the official rules and entering direct relations with employers in Germany, because they were also happy to have their people go and then to have these people send money back for some local repairs, for the local school, for a new bell tower of the church, and so on. So the local level is hugely important. Yugoslavia is really very decentralized, and the local government did have quite, even formally, quite some discretion, and informally even more. Please.
So this practice was unique to Yugoslavia because the other Iron Curtain countries were doing it either not at all or very little.
Mm-hmm.
I've heard that in 1990, as the Russian Iron Curtain was starting to come down, that Yugoslavia perhaps was better positioned than the other Eastern Europe or Southern European countries for development.
Mm-hmm.
And do you think that's at all true? And do you think that migration had anything to do with it?
Mm-hmm. In many ways, it was true. By the late 1980s, the European Community, as it was called then, now the European Union, was negotiating with Yugoslavia about an association agreement, which nowadays is the first step towards full membership in the European Union. So, and if you would interview experts in the late 1980s, which country of the then soon to be former socialist countries would be the first joining European Union, probably most of them would have pointed their finger to Yugoslavia, because it was much more integrated into the global economy, which came with many drawbacks, also in terms of migration. Also because the Yugoslav economy was also not super competitive and grew very, very dependent on capital inflow from the West, and migrants were part of this capital inflow story. The migrant savings, remittances were more important source of foreign currency for Yugoslavia than tourism, for example. But in a way, they also helped Yugoslavia to put at a better sort of starting position, because there was this small migrant businesses, transnational links. People knew much more about the West and also social reality in the West than in other countries behind the Iron Curtain, and it was basically a failure of Yugoslavia's political elites to waste this, and not only to waste, but then even to push the country into war. And war was certainly not inevitable. State dissolution, there was more logic in it because of the high degree of decentralization that was reached already in the mid-1970s, which made the political system pretty incoherent, and there were some inbuilt tendencies towards dissolution of the federation. Because after '74, basically Yugoslavia was more of a confederation than a federation. And as we nowadays can also observe in Europe, having a semi-federative political unity of states that are still national states, and which huge regional disparities in terms of economic prosperity, that creates some really huge problems in keeping such a thing together. And at the end, Yugoslavia, I think, broke down because of its huge economic disparities, and their migration was part of the story. But they at least could have done it peacefully.
Do you think Yugoslav history, going back to the Ottoman period or even the Empire period, affected the ability of the parts of Yugoslavia to?
I mean, it affected not as a sort of not in terms of a path dependency, but it was consequential in terms of how people thought about history, because history in the late 1980s, and this referred to World War II, but also to the Ottoman past and to the many divisions of this region at that period. History became a major argument in the political debate, but I think it was not preordained. I mean, for 50 years, almost 50 years, this country was kept together. So there was no reason to break apart and then even enter in a war. I would not say that sort of ancient ethnic conflict was the main, but the idea that there was something like an ancient ethnic hatred, that became consequential, because indeed many people started by the late 1980s or were made to think of ethnic relations in Yugoslavia being bad and always having been bad. But we know from sociological surveys from that period that basically most people in Yugoslavia considered ethnic relations not a problem, with the exception of Kosovo. It was the only region where this was really considered a problem. But people, when asked what are the problems that Yugoslavia faces, they were talking about unemployment, they were talking about super high inflation, but not about ethnic hatred. This was something that came up rather in a very contingent way, but also, of course, manipulated by certain political entrepreneurs in the late 1980s. And the diaspora also played a role in that. And some of these crazy ideas were sort of nourished in places like Toronto, for example, a big place for the Macedonian diaspora, or around, I don't know, the Croatian diaspora communities, and then fed back to Yugoslavia. So there you have also a migration dimension in the breakup of Yugoslavia, because for a short historical moment, these transnational anti-Yugoslav diasporas really became important. They were not very important until then, and they also would lose their importance very soon once the national states were established.
Do you think the Latin script versus Cyrillic script played a role in that?
No. Only in terms of political ideologies. Of course, these differences, they can be politicized and can be ideologized, but I mean, in Serbia up to this day, of course, it's also contentious in a way, but Cyrillic and Latin are used in a parallel manner. Obviously, you do make a political statement if you print your newspaper in Cyrillic or in Latin letters, but both is fine, which is, by the way, an achievement. There are not very many countries where two parallel alphabets exist in a rather peaceful way.
We have like 2 minutes
Okay.
left for one
And
brief question. Was there another one in the back?
There were two. Maybe we can put them together and.
Yes, if you can very briefly, and then
The answer also needs to be brief. Yes.
Thank you.
Okay, I understand.
Please.
Okay.
Go ahead.
You were first. No, go ahead. Very brief. Is it possible to compare the case Yugoslavia and Turkey when it comes to the reaction of the government on protests because of labor migration? Is it comparable?
I just had a question about the pre-socialist diaspora. Was there any discourse about them in the newspapers you were examining, and if so, what was that discourse like vis-a-vis the socialist Gastarbeiter diaspora?
The short answer to both questions would be yes. Everything is compared, but the comparison would actually even make sense, because Turkey and Yugoslavia, they shared many similarities when it came to the policies of immigration, but also important difficulties. What Turkey certainly managed to do is to build up a diaspora in a much more systematic way, but which is also a function of the high degree of alienation that Turkish immigrants, especially in places like Germany or the Netherlands, experience. So I think that's sort of the emotional or the affective source into which the Turkish diaspora politics, which became very influential, can tap. I mean, these people, they for example, voted to a much higher degree yes to the constitutional changes empowering the president than the Turkish electorate. So in a way, they're much more pro-Erdogan than citizens in Turkey herself. And yes, there was some sort of a little bit not very direct, very often more implicit references, but especially when it came to describing the malign activities of the pre-communist diaspora. Newspapers were very much towing the party line and describing these terrorist attacks and other anti-Yugoslav actions taken by radically nationalist and anti-communist emigres.
On that cheery note.
Yes, when you talk about migration in Europe, you can end only on cheery notes.
Yeah. Thank you very much for coming to Ann Arbor.